Number 1. Graham Dwyer, the architect of murder. On a cold November morning in 2013, a dog walker stumbled upon human remains in the Killiney Hills outside Dublin, a discovery that would unravel one of Ireland's most disturbing murder cases and expose a hidden world of violent sexual fantasies that had culminated in brutal murder. The victim was Elaine O'Hara, a 36-year-old childcare worker who had been missing for over a year, and the man responsible for her death was Graham Dwyer, a 42-year-old architect living what appeared to be a conventional suburban life in Foxrock, one of Dublin's most affluent neighborhoods. Dwyer was married with 3 children, held a respectable position at A&D Wedshirt and Partners Architects, and presented himself as an ordinary family man. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay a dangerous predator with sadistic sexual obsessions that he had been nurturing and acting upon for years. Elaine O'Hara had suffered from severe depression throughout her adult life and had made multiple suicide attempts, spending considerable time receiving treatment at St. Edmundsbury Psychiatric Hospital in Lucan, where she was a voluntary patient seeking help for her mental health struggles. It was during one of her stays at this facility that she first encountered Dwyer in 2007, though the exact circumstances of their initial meeting remained somewhat unclear during the investigation. What became abundantly clear through recovered evidence was that Dwyer had deliberately targeted O'Hara, identifying her as someone whose vulnerability, isolation, and mental health challenges made her the perfect victim for his increasingly violent sexual fantasies. Over the years that followed their initial contact, Dwyer engaged O'Hara in a relationship that was fundamentally based on his desire to inflict pain and dominate her completely, gradually escalating his demands and pushing boundaries in ways that prepared her for what would ultimately be her murder. The relationship was characterized by BDSM activities, but crucially, evidence would later show that Dwyer's interest extended far beyond consensual practices into territory that involved his explicit desire to kill a woman during sex, fantasies he had documented in searches on his computer and in communications with others. O'Hara, desperate for connection and companionship, and struggling with feelings of worthlessness due to her mental health condition, became trapped in this relationship, unable to extricate herself from Dwyer's control even as his demands became more dangerous and his violence more extreme. In the months leading up to her disappearance on August 22, 2012, Dwyer had been carefully planning her murder, purchasing items that would later be recovered and used as evidence against him, including knives and restraints. On that August day, O'Hara left her home in the morning and was never seen alive again by anyone except her killer. Her disappearance was reported, and while police conducted searches and investigations, the case initially went cold with no body, no crime scene, and limited evidence to suggest what had happened to her. It was only when the prolonged drought in the summer of 2013 caused water levels to drop significantly in the Vartry Reservoir in County Wicklow that the first breakthrough came. A reservoir worker discovered keys, and subsequently, 2 mobile phones emerged from the receding waters, phones that would prove to be the crucial evidence that would ultimately convict Graham Dwyer of murder. When technical experts examined these phones, they uncovered thousands of text messages between Dwyer and O'Hara that painted a horrifying picture of their relationship and Dwyer's intentions. The messages showed Dwyer explicitly discussing his desire to kill O'Hara, stabbing her and watching her bleed to death, fantasies that he described in graphic detail. These were not role-playing scenarios or fantasy discussions in the context of consensual BDSM, as Dwyer would later claim in his defense, but rather evidence of genuine intent, particularly given that O'Hara had actually disappeared and been killed. The phones also contained evidence of Dwyer's communications with other women, indicating that his violent sexual interests were not limited to O'Hara and that he had been seeking other potential victims who might be willing to engage in increasingly dangerous activities. When investigators connected the phones to Dwyer and O'Hara, and then discovered O'Hara's remains in Killiney, the investigation accelerated rapidly. Forensic examination of the remains was challenging given their condition after more than a year in the hills, but pathologists were able to determine that O'Hara had suffered stab wounds, consistent with the manner of death that Dwyer had described in his messages. The investigation team, led by experienced detectives who recognized they were dealing with a calculated and dangerous killer, began building their case meticulously. They obtained warrants to search Dwyer's home, workplace, and vehicles, recovering a treasure trove of evidence that connected him to the murder. Among the items found were restraints, knives, and cleaning materials, as well as Dwyer's computer, which contained internet search history that proved devastating to his case. Dwyer had searched for terms including how to kill with a knife, tips for killing a person, flesh-eating animals in Ireland, and numerous other searches that demonstrated his planning and intent to commit murder. He had also researched locations, including the Killiney area where O'Hara's body was eventually found, showing that he had scouted the disposal site in advance. The evidence against Dwyer was overwhelming, combining the text messages, the internet searches, the physical evidence, and the testimony of witnesses who could place him in locations relevant to the crime. When he was arrested and charged with murder, Dwyer maintained his innocence, claiming that his relationship with O'Hara was consensual, that the text messages were fantasy roleplay, and that he had nothing to do with her death. His defense team would later argue at trial that O'Hara had actually committed suicide, pointing to her history of mental illness and previous suicide attempts, and suggesting that the text messages were simply part of their relationship dynamic rather than evidence of murder. The trial, which began in January 2015 at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin, became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Irish history, attracting massive media attention and public interest. Over the course of the trial, which lasted several weeks, the prosecution presented their case methodically, walking the jury through the evidence piece by piece and building an irrefutable narrative of premeditated murder. The text messages were read in court, shocking the public gallery with their explicit content and Dwyer's clear expressions of his desire to kill. Expert witnesses testified about the phone records, the internet searches, and the forensic evidence recovered from the crime scene and Dwyer's possessions. The prosecution argued that Dwyer had groomed O'Hara over years, exploiting her vulnerability and mental health struggles to draw her into increasingly dangerous situations, ultimately leading her to a remote location on August 22, 2012, where he stabbed her to death in fulfillment of his sadistic fantasies. The defense attempted to undermine the prosecution's case by emphasizing O'Hara's mental health history and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence, but they faced an uphill battle given the sheer volume and consistency of the evidence against their client. Dwyer himself chose not to testify, a decision that meant the jury never heard his direct account of events, leaving the evidence to speak for itself. After hearing all the evidence and the closing arguments from both sides, the jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. On March 27, 2015, Graham Dwyer was found guilty of the murder of Elaine O'Hara, a verdict that brought relief to O'Hara's family, who had endured years of not knowing what had happened to their loved one, followed by the ordeal of the trial and the public exposure of the details of her final years and death. Dwyer was sentenced to life imprisonment, the mandatory sentence for murder in Ireland, and he was led away from court showing no emotion, maintaining the same cold demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. The case had profound implications for Irish society and law enforcement, highlighting the dangers that can lurk behind respectable facades and raising awareness about the manipulation and abuse of vulnerable individuals. It also prompted discussions about digital privacy and evidence, as the recovery of the phones from the reservoir and the extraction of their data had been crucial to securing the conviction. In the years following his conviction, Dwyer launched appeals against his conviction, primarily focusing on the use of the mobile phone data as evidence, arguing that the retention and accessing of such data violated his privacy rights under European law. These appeals worked their way through the Irish court system and eventually reached the European Court of Justice, which ruled in 2020 that the blanket retention of telecommunications data was indeed contrary to EU law, though this did not automatically overturn Dwyer's conviction. The Irish courts subsequently had to consider whether the evidence obtained from the phones should have been excluded from his trial, a legal question that raised concerns about whether one of Ireland's most notorious killers might have his conviction quashed on a technicality. However, in 2022, the Court of Appeal ultimately rejected Dwyer's appeal, ruling that while the data retention regime was problematic, the evidence was admissible in this case given the gravity of the offense and the public interest in prosecuting serious crime. Dwyer remains in prison serving his life sentence, and while he continues to maintain his innocence, the evidence against him remains overwhelming in the eyes of the law and the public. The case of Graham Dwyer stands as one of Ireland's most disturbing murder cases, not only because of the brutal nature of the crime itself, but because it revealed how someone living an apparently normal life in an affluent suburb could be harboring such dark and violent fantasies, and how those fantasies could lead to the deliberate, planned murder of a vulnerable woman who had been systematically groomed and manipulated. For Elaine O'Hara's family, the case brought some measure of justice, though no verdict could restore what they had lost or erase the pain of knowing the circumstances of her death. The case remains a stark reminder of the importance of recognizing and protecting vulnerable individuals, the value of thorough police investigation and modern forensic techniques, and the reality that evil can exist behind even the most ordinary and respectable appearances. Number 2. The Scissor Sisters. The murder of Farah Suella Noor. In March 2005, residents of the Royal Canal in Dublin began noticing plastic bags floating in the water and caught in the reeds along the banks, a sight that initially seemed like ordinary littering in an urban waterway. But when some of these bags were opened, the horrific truth emerged that they contained human body parts, specifically the dismembered remains of a man whose murder and butchering would become known as one of the most gruesome crimes in Irish history. The victim was Farah Suella Noor, a 38-year-old Kenyan man who had been living in Dublin for several years, and the individuals responsible for his death and the shocking disposal of his body were two sisters, Linda Mulhall and Charlotte Mulhall, along with their mother Kathleen Mulhall, a case that would shock Ireland not only for its brutality but for the domestic circumstances that had led to it. Farah Noor had met Kathleen Mulhall in a pub in 2004, and despite being married with a family, Kathleen had begun a relationship with him, a relationship characterized by heavy drinking, drug use, and increasingly volatile behavior from Noor, who could become violent and abusive when intoxicated. Kathleen's daughters, Linda and Charlotte, had difficult relationships with their mother and were aware of her involvement with Noor, a man they found threatening and problematic, particularly given his history of violence toward their mother. The events leading to Noor's death began on the night of March 20, 2005, when Kathleen, Linda, and Charlotte had been drinking together at Kathleen's flat in Ballyba, North Dublin, a gathering that was not unusual for the family, who frequently consumed alcohol together. At some point during the evening, Farah Noor arrived at the flat, and what happened next would be disputed in terms of the exact sequence of events and the motivations of those involved. But the outcome was undeniable. Noor ended up dead, and his body was subjected to a horrific dismemberment that suggested both panic and a desperate attempt to dispose of evidence. According to accounts that emerged during the investigation and trial, Noor had been drinking and taking drugs, and his behavior had become increasingly aggressive and sexually inappropriate toward the women in the flat. The precise trigger for the violence that followed remains somewhat unclear, with different accounts suggesting either that Noor had attempted to sexually assault one or both of the sisters, or that an argument had escalated into physical confrontation. What is certain is that at some point, Linda and Charlotte Mulhall attacked Farah Noor with knives, stabbing him repeatedly in a frenzied assault that left him dead on the floor of the flat. The sisters, now faced with a corpse and the reality of what they had done, made the catastrophic decision to try to hide the crime by dismembering Noor's body and disposing of it in a way that they hoped would prevent identification and therefore prevent the crime from being traced back to them. In the bathroom of the small flat, The two sisters proceeded to cut up Noor's body using kitchen knives and a hammer, a process that took hours and that they later described in statements to police. Accounts that were so horrific in their detail that even experienced detectives found them disturbing. They cut off his head, arms, and legs, separating his body into multiple pieces that they then placed into plastic shopping bags. The head was never recovered despite extensive searches, leading to speculation that it had been disposed of separately, possibly thrown into the river from a bridge where it would have sunk or been carried out to sea. The other body parts were placed in the bags and thrown into the Royal Canal at various points over the following days, the sisters making multiple trips to different locations along the canal to dispose of the evidence. Their mother, Kathleen, was aware of what had happened and helped to clean the flat, attempting to remove the blood and other evidence of the killing, though she did not participate in the dismemberment itself. The discovery of the body parts in the canal triggered a major investigation by the Gardaí, who immediately recognized that they were dealing with a murder and a particularly disturbing one given the dismemberment. Without a head, identifying the victim proved challenging initially, but investigators were able to use other means to establish that the remains belonged to Farah Noor, including dental records and the process of elimination when Noor was reported missing by acquaintances who knew him. Once the victim was identified, detectives began building a picture of his life, his associates, and his last known whereabouts, a process that led them to Kathleen Mulhall and her daughters. When police interviewed the Mulhall family, the initial responses were denials and attempts to deflect suspicion, but as the investigation progressed and evidence mounted, the sisters' stories began to fall apart. Forensic examination of Kathleen's flat revealed extensive evidence of the crime despite the cleanup attempts, including blood traces that matched Noor's DNA and other physical evidence that placed him in the flat at the time of his death. Faced with this evidence and the pressure of police interrogation, the Mulhall sisters eventually confessed to killing Noor and dismembering his body, though their accounts of the motivation and the precise details varied, with each sister attempting to minimize her own role while placing more blame on the other. Linda Mulhall claimed that she had acted in defense of her sister, stating that Noor had been attempting to rape Charlotte and that she had grabbed a knife and stabbed him to protect her. Charlotte's account suggested that both sisters had been involved in the attack and that it had been a joint effort to stop Noor's assault. The question of whether this was a legitimate case of self-defense or defense of another, or whether it was a more deliberate killing, would become central to the legal proceedings that followed. The prosecution would argue that even if Noor had been behaving inappropriately or aggressively, the level of violence used against him and the subsequent dismemberment indicated that this went beyond reasonable self-defense and constituted murder. The case went to trial in 2006, with both sisters facing murder charges, though they were tried separately due to the conflicting nature of their accounts and their attempts to implicate each other. The trials attracted enormous media attention, with the case being dubbed the Scissor Sisters case by the tabloid press, a nickname that referenced both the sisters' involvement and the gruesome nature of the dismemberment, though the name was considered tasteless and disrespectful by many given the serious nature of the crime. During Charlotte Mulhall's trial, the prosecution presented evidence of the killing and the dismemberment, walking the jury through the forensic evidence, the confessions, and the circumstances of the crime. Charlotte's defense team argued that she had been acting in self-defense or defense of her sister, that Noor had been the aggressor, and that her subsequent actions in dismembering the body, while horrific, were the result of panic and poor judgment rather than an indication of murderous intent. The jury, however, was not convinced that self-defense justified what had occurred, and in October 2006, Charlotte Mulhall was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, the mandatory sentence for murder in Ireland. Linda Mulhall's trial followed, and her defense similarly attempted to argue self-defense and protection of her sister. But again, the prosecution emphasized the violence of the attack, the number of stab wounds inflicted on Noor, and the calculated nature of the dismemberment and disposal of the body. Linda was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that suggested the jury accepted that there were some mitigating circumstances or that there was doubt about her specific intent to kill, and she was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Kathleen Mulhall was charged with helping to clean up the crime scene and attempting to impede the investigation, and she pleaded guilty to these charges, receiving a suspended sentence given her lesser role in the actual killing. The case prompted widespread discussion in Ireland about domestic violence, dysfunctional families, alcohol and drug abuse, and the circumstances that can lead to such extreme violence. Some commentators expressed sympathy for the Mulhall sisters, arguing that they had been victims of Noor's abuse and that their actions, while extreme, were understandable in the context of the threat they faced. Others focused on the brutality of the dismemberment and argued that this indicated a level of callousness that went beyond simple self-defense. The case also raised questions about the treatment of women in the criminal justice system, with some arguing that the sisters had received unduly harsh sentences given the circumstances, while others felt that the sentences were appropriate given the severity of the crime. In the years since their convictions, both sisters have remained in prison, with Charlotte serving her life sentence and Linda serving her 15-year sentence, though she has since been released having served her time. The case remains one of the most notorious in Irish criminal history, remembered not only for the shocking nature of the crime itself but for the questions it raised about violence, victimization, and the complex circumstances that can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of brutality. For Farah Noor's family, the case brought some measure of justice, though the circumstances of his death and the public nature of the trial and the media coverage meant that his killing became a spectacle rather than simply a tragedy. The Scissor Sisters case serves as a reminder of how quickly situations can escalate into violence when alcohol, drugs, and volatile relationships combine, and how the consequences of a few moments of violence can reverberate for years, destroying multiple lives and families in the process. Number 3. Joe O'Reilly. The murder of Rachel O'Reilly. On the morning of October 4, 2004, Joe O'Reilly called emergency services to report that he had come home from work to find his wife Rachel dead in their house in Baldera, County Dublin. A discovery that initially appeared to be the tragic result of a burglary gone wrong, but which would eventually be revealed as a calculated murder committed by Rachel's own husband in a case that gripped Ireland for years. Rachel O'Reilly was a 30-year-old mother of 2 young boys, a popular and well-liked woman who worked part-time at her mother's childcare facility and who appeared to have a stable family life in the suburbs of North Dublin. Her husband Joe worked in advertising sales and presented himself as a devoted father and husband, but beneath this facade, their marriage had been deteriorating for months, strained by Joe's infidelity and his growing obsession with another woman, Nikki Pelly, a work colleague with whom he had been having an affair. Rachel had discovered the affair and had confronted Joe about it, demanding that he end the relationship and commit to their marriage and family. But Joe had not been willing to give up his relationship with Nikki, nor was he willing to face the financial and social consequences of a divorce. Instead, he began planning to murder Rachel, a decision that would allow him to be free of his marriage while avoiding the stigma and cost of divorce, and potentially collecting on Rachel's life insurance. The morning of October 4th began as a normal Monday, with Joe leaving for work and Rachel staying home with their 2 young sons before taking them to her mother's house as she typically did on weekday mornings. What Rachel did not know was that Joe had not actually gone to work that morning, but had instead parked his car some distance away and waited for the right moment to return to the house. Using his knowledge of Rachel's routine, Joe knew that she would return home alone after dropping the children at her mother's, giving him a window of opportunity to commit the murder. CCTV footage would later show Joe's car traveling routes that were inconsistent with his journey to work, evidence that proved he had not been where he claimed to be during the crucial time period. When Rachel returned home around 10 a.m., Joe was waiting for her, and he attacked her with brutal violence, beating her to death with a dumbbell in their bedroom, striking her repeatedly in the head and face with such force that her injuries were catastrophic. The attack was savage and prolonged, indicating a level of rage that went beyond what was necessary to kill, and forensic experts would later testify that Rachel had suffered defensive wounds suggesting she had tried to fight off her attacker, wounds that were consistent with her knowing her killer and trying to defend herself from someone she had trusted. After killing Rachel, Joe attempted to stage the scene to make it appear that the house had been burgled and that Rachel had disturbed an intruder who had then killed her. He ransacked rooms, opened drawers and cupboards, and took some items to make it look like a robbery. Then he left the house and returned to his car, driving to work where he created an alibi by making phone calls and being visible to colleagues, establishing his presence at the workplace during the afternoon. That evening, after finishing work at the time he normally would have, Joe drove home and called emergency services to report finding Rachel dead, playing the role of the shocked and grieving husband discovering his wife's murder. When Gardaí arrived at the scene, they initially treated it as a burglary murder, interviewing neighbors, searching for evidence of forced entry, and beginning the process of investigating who might have broken into the house and killed Rachel. Joe gave statements to police, describing his movements that day and his discovery of Rachel's body, and he appeared to be cooperating fully with the investigation. However, even in those early stages, experienced detectives noticed inconsistencies in Joe's account and aspects of the crime scene that did not quite fit the burglary scenario. The level of violence used against Rachel seemed personal rather than the work of a burglar who had been surprised, and the staging of the scene had elements that seemed staged, details that did not align with genuine burglaries. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to look more closely at Joe himself, particularly when they learned about his affair with Nikki Pelly and the marital problems that Rachel's family reported. When investigators examined phone records and CCTV footage from the morning of the murder, they discovered evidence that contradicted Joe's account of his movements. CCTV cameras along routes between the O'Reilly home and Joe's workplace captured his car traveling at times and in locations that were inconsistent with his story of going directly to work that morning. Phone records showed that his mobile phone had connected to cell towers near his home during the time he claimed to be at work, evidence that placed him in the area when Rachel was killed. This evidence was crucial because it destroyed Joe's alibi and indicated that he had lied about his whereabouts, a strong indicator of guilt. Detectives also discovered that Joe had been researching ways to commit murder and avoid detection, including internet searches on his work computer for topics related to murder investigation and forensic techniques. As the evidence mounted, Joe maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been at work and that someone else must have killed Rachel. But his story became increasingly difficult to sustain. The Gardaí conducted extensive interviews with Joe, confronting him with the evidence and giving him opportunities to explain the inconsistencies. But he stuck to his story, even as it became clear that the evidence contradicted his account at virtually every point. In November 2004, just weeks after Rachel's murder, Joe was arrested and charged with her murder, a development that shocked many who knew the couple and who had believed Joe's performance as the grieving widower. The trial, which took place in 2007 at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin, was one of the most high-profile murder trials in Irish history, attracting massive media coverage and public interest. The prosecution presented a compelling case built on the CCTV evidence, the phone records, the forensic evidence from the crime scene, and testimony from witnesses who described Joe's affair and the state of his marriage. They argued that Joe had murdered Rachel because he wanted to be free to pursue his relationship with Nikki Pelly without the complications and costs of divorce, and that he had planned and executed the murder in a calculated way, staging the scene to deflect suspicion. The evidence of his movements on the morning of the murder was particularly damning, with the prosecution using CCTV footage and phone records to track his car and phone, showing that he had not been where he claimed and that he had been in the vicinity of his home at the time Rachel was killed. Expert witnesses testified about the nature of Rachel's injuries, the staging of the crime scene, and the forensic evidence that linked Joe to the murder. Perhaps most devastating to Joe's defense were statements from witnesses who described his behavior after Rachel's death, including his continued relationship with Nikki Pelly and his apparent lack of genuine grief. behaviors that suggested a man who had gotten what he wanted rather than a man mourning the loss of his wife. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that it was possible someone else had committed the murder, but they faced the challenge of explaining away the CCTV footage, the phone records, and the other evidence that placed Joe at the scene. Joe chose to testify in his own defense, taking the stand to deny killing Rachel and to insist that he had been at work as he had always claimed, but his testimony was unconvincing, and under cross-examination by the prosecution, he struggled to explain the evidence against him. After a trial lasting several weeks, the jury deliberated for just over 8 hours before returning a guilty verdict on July 21, 2007, finding Joe O'Reilly guilty of the murder of his wife Rachel. The verdict was met with relief by Rachel's family, who had endured years of grief compounded by Joe's lies and his attempts to evade justice. Joe was sentenced to life imprisonment, and he was led from the courtroom showing little emotion, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. In the years since his conviction, Joe has continued to maintain his innocence and has launched several appeals, all of which have been unsuccessful, with the courts finding that his conviction was safe and that the evidence against him was overwhelming. He remains in prison serving his life sentence, and his case has become a landmark example of how modern forensic techniques, particularly CCTV evidence and phone records, can be used to solve crimes and secure convictions even in cases where there are no eyewitnesses to the actual killing. The murder of Rachel O'Reilly had a profound impact on her family, particularly her 2 young sons, who lost their mother to violence and their father to prison, and who have had to grow up knowing the terrible circumstances of their mother's death. Rachel's family has spoken publicly about their loss and about the importance of justice, and they have worked to ensure that Rachel is remembered not as a victim but as the loving mother and daughter she was. The case also highlighted the dangers of domestic violence and the risks faced by women in marriages where there is infidelity and conflict, serving as a reminder that the most dangerous place for many women is in their own homes with partners who may present one face to the world while harboring violence beneath the surface. Joe O'Reilly's calculated murder of his wife, his attempts to frame the killing as a burglary, and his continued denials even in the face of overwhelming evidence mark this as one of Ireland's most disturbing domestic murders, a case where modern investigative techniques were essential in achieving justice for Rachel and ensuring that her killer was held accountable for his crime. Number 4. The Vanishing Triangle, the disappearances that haunt Ireland. Between 1993 and 1998, at least 6 young women vanished without a trace from locations along Ireland's eastern coast, disappearances that occurred within a geographical area that came to be known as the Vanishing Triangle, a term that described the region bounded roughly by Dublin, Portlaoise, and Galway where these women were last seen before they disappeared into circumstances that remain largely unresolved to this day. The cases share disturbing similarities that have led investigators and criminologists to suspect that some or all of these disappearances may be linked, possibly the work of a serial killer or killers who operated across this region during the 1990s, preying on vulnerable women and leaving behind grieving families and communities haunted by unanswered questions. The first of these disappearances was that of Annie Bridget McCarrick, a 26-year-old American woman who had moved to Ireland to study and who vanished on March 26, 1993, after she was last seen in Johnny Fox's pub in the Dublin Mountains, a popular establishment that she had apparently visited after taking a bus from Dublin city centre. Annie had been living in Sandymount and working as a teacher, and she had been planning to move back to the United States in the coming months. But she never made it home that night, and despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of her has ever been found. Her disappearance was initially treated as a possible voluntary missing person case, with some speculation that she might have chosen to disappear or that she had met with an accident in the mountains. But as time passed and no evidence emerged to support these theories, the likelihood that she had been abducted and murdered became the prevailing theory among investigators. The second disappearance occurred on November 9, 1993, when Jojo Dullard, a 21-year-old woman from Callan, County Kilkenny, vanished after missing her last bus home from Dublin and attempting to hitchhike back to Callan. Jo had been in Dublin visiting friends and had called her friend from a phone box in Moon, County Kildare, at around 11:30 p.m. to say that she had gotten a lift and was on her way home, but she was never seen again. Her disappearance sparked a major investigation and search operation, with Gardaí conducting extensive inquiries and searches in the areas where she was last known to have been, but no trace of her was found. The fact that she had been hitchhiking raised the obvious possibility that she had been picked up by someone with malicious intent, and over the years, various suspects have been investigated in connection with her disappearance, though no one has ever been charged and her body has never been recovered. In 1995, another young woman disappeared under circumstances that added to the growing pattern. Fiona Pender, a 25-year-old pregnant woman from Tullamore, County Offaly, vanished from her apartment on August 23, 1995, 7 months pregnant with her first child. Fiona had been living with her boyfriend, and the circumstances of her disappearance suggested that she had not left voluntarily, as all her possessions remained in the apartment and there was no indication that she had planned to go anywhere. Her boyfriend became a person of interest in the investigation, and over the years, suspicion has continued to focus on those closest to her, though no charges were ever brought and Fiona's body has never been found. The loss of both Fiona and her unborn child made this case particularly tragic and generated significant public sympathy and ongoing interest in finding answers. Ciara Breen, an 18-year-old from Dundalk, County Louth, disappeared on February 13, 1997, after leaving her home to meet someone, though the identity of this person and the purpose of the meeting have never been conclusively established. Ciara had been involved in a relationship that her family had concerns about, and there has been speculation that she may have been meeting this person on the night she disappeared, but without concrete evidence, the investigation has struggled to make progress. Searches were conducted in areas around Dundalk and in places where it was thought she might have gone, but no trace of Ciara has been found. Fiona Sinnott, a 19-year-old mother from Broadway, County Wexford, disappeared on February 9, 1998, after leaving a pub in the early hours of the morning. Fiona had been at the pub with the father of her child, and witnesses reported that there had been some tension between them that evening. She was last seen alive returning to her home, but she was never seen again, and despite extensive investigations that have continued for decades, including searches of properties and questioning of suspects, no trace of her has been found. The father of her child has been a person of interest in the investigation, and in recent years, renewed efforts have been made to search areas where it is believed her body may have been concealed, but as of now, the case remains unsolved. Deirdre Jacob, an 18-year-old trainee teacher from Newbridge, County Kildare, disappeared on July 28, 1998, in broad daylight from a road very close to her family home. Deirdre had been walking home from Newbridge Town Centre, a walk she had made countless times before, and she was last seen by a witness just a few hundred meters from her house, but she never arrived home. Her disappearance in the middle of the day on a road she knew well suggested an abduction, and the fact that no trace of her has been found despite extensive searches and investigations has made this case particularly baffling and distressing for her family. Over the years, various suspects have been investigated in connection with Deirdre's disappearance, including individuals who were known to be in the area at the time and who had histories of sexual offenses or violence against women. These 6 cases, along with other disappearances that occurred in Ireland during the same period, have been the subject of extensive investigation by the Gardaí, and in 2007, a special investigation called Operation Trace was established to review all the cases and to look for possible links between them. Operation Trace examined hundreds of missing persons cases and identified these 6 women, along with 2 others, as cases that warranted particular attention due to the similarities in circumstances and the geographical and temporal clustering. The investigation has considered the possibility that a serial killer may have been operating in the region during the 1990s, targeting young women who were alone or vulnerable, and various suspects have been investigated over the years, though no one has been charged in connection with multiple disappearances. One individual who has been of particular interest to investigators is Larry Murphy, a convicted rapist who was arrested in 2000 after he abducted and sexually assaulted a woman in County Carlow, an attack that was only stopped when two hunters stumbled upon Murphy's van and rescued the victim, likely saving her life. Murphy was convicted of this attack and served time in prison before being released in 2010, but he has never been charged in connection with any of the Vanishing Triangle cases, though many investigators and members of the public believe he may have been involved in some of the disappearances given the geographical and temporal overlap between the disappearances and Murphy's activities. Murphy has consistently denied any involvement in the disappearances, and without evidence linking him to the crimes, he has never been charged, a situation that has been deeply frustrating for the families of the missing women and for investigators who believe that the cases may remain unsolved unless someone comes forward with new information. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to solve these cases, with advances in forensic technology and new investigative techniques being applied to old evidence. In 2020, Deirdre Jacobs' case was upgraded from a missing person investigation to a murder investigation, indicating that Gardaí now believe she was murdered and that they have specific suspects in mind, though no arrests have been made public. Similarly, there have been renewed searches and investigations in several of the other cases, with property searches conducted and persons of interest questioned, but as of now, none of the cases has resulted in a prosecution or the recovery of remains. The families of the missing women have endured decades of uncertainty and pain, not knowing what happened to their loved ones or where their bodies might be, and they have campaigned tirelessly for answers, working with media, law enforcement, and victim advocacy groups to keep the cases in the public eye and to pressure authorities to continue investigating. The Vanishing Triangle cases remain among Ireland's most haunting unsolved mysteries, representing not only individual tragedies for the families involved, but also a broader failure of the criminal justice system to protect vulnerable women and to solve cases that occurred during a period when investigative resources and techniques were not as advanced as they are today. The cases have prompted discussions about women's safety, about the importance of taking missing persons cases seriously from the outset, and about the need for better coordination and resources in investigating potential serial crimes. For the families of Annie McCarrick, Jojo Dullard, Fiona Pender, Sierra Breen, Fiona Sinnott, and Deirdre Jacob, the hope remains that advances in forensic science, new witness testimony, or someone's conscience will finally provide the answers they have sought for so many years, and that the person or persons responsible for these disappearances will be brought to justice, allowing the families to finally lay their loved ones to rest and find some measure of peace after decades of uncertainty and grief. Number 5. Catherine Nevin, the Black Widow of Wicklow. On the night of March 19, 1996, Tom Nevin was shot dead during what appeared to be a robbery at Jack White's Inn, a rural pub in Britas Bay, County Wicklow, that he ran with his wife Catherine. And while the initial investigation focused on the possibility of a botched robbery by external criminals, suspicions quickly turned to Catherine herself, a woman who would eventually be convicted of arranging her husband's murder in one of Ireland's most sensational trials. Catherine Nevin was a complex and controversial figure, a woman who presented different faces to different people, and who cultivated an image of respectability and charm while allegedly plotting the murder of her husband for years before it finally occurred. Tom and Catherine had run Jack White's Inn together for several years, operating a successful business that catered to locals and travelers along the Wicklow coast. But beneath the surface of their business partnership, their marriage was troubled, marked by infidelity, financial disputes, and growing animosity. Catherine had been having affairs with other men, including members of the Gardaí and local politicians, relationships that she cultivated carefully and that would later become relevant to the investigation into Tom's murder. On the night of the killing, Catherine's account was that she had been upstairs in the living quarters when she heard noises, and when she came downstairs, she found that Tom had been shot during what appeared to be a robbery, with the pub safe having been opened and money taken. She called the Gardaí, and when they arrived, The scene appeared to support her account of a robbery gone wrong, but experienced investigators noticed details that troubled them. The way the safe had been opened suggested someone with knowledge of how it worked. The manner of Tom's shooting seemed more execution style than the work of panicked robbers, and Catherine's demeanor and behavior raised questions about her level of genuine distress. As the investigation progressed, detectives began uncovering information that pointed toward Catherine's involvement in planning Tom's murder rather than being an innocent victim of a crime. Witnesses came forward with explosive testimony, claiming that Catherine had approached them in the years before the murder and asked them to kill her husband, offering them money and other incentives to carry out the killing. These witnesses included John Jones, William McLean, and Jerry Heaps, men who testified that Catherine had solicited them to murder Tom, approaching them on multiple occasions and discussing various methods and scenarios for how the killing could be carried out. According to their testimony, Catherine had been planning Tom's murder for years, repeatedly seeking someone willing to carry it out, a pattern of behavior that suggested premeditation and determination rather than a spontaneous crime of passion. The motive for wanting Tom dead appeared to be primarily financial, as Catherine stood to inherit the pub and Tom's assets upon his death. But there were also suggestions that she wanted to be free of the marriage to pursue relationships with other men without the complications and social stigma of divorce. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Catherine's affairs and her connections to influential people, relationships that she had cultivated strategically and that some suggested she had tried to leverage to influence the investigation and protect herself from suspicion. When Catherine was arrested and charged with Tom's murder, as well as with soliciting others to murder him, she maintained her innocence, portraying herself as a grieving widow who was being unfairly targeted by police. The trial, which took place in 2000, became a media sensation, with Catherine playing to the cameras and presenting herself as a sophisticated businesswoman who was the victim of a conspiracy rather than a murderer. The prosecution presented the testimony of the men Catherine had allegedly solicited to kill Tom, along with forensic evidence from the crime scene and evidence of Catherine's financial motivations and her behavior before and after the murder. The witnesses who testified about Catherine's solicitations provided detailed accounts of her approaches to them, describing specific conversations where she had discussed how Tom could be killed and how much she would pay for the service. These witnesses were cross-examined extensively by the defense, which attempted to portray them as unreliable and motivated by their own interests, but their accounts were consistent and detailed enough to convince the jury. The prosecution also presented evidence of Catherine's affairs and her financial situation, arguing that she had clear motives to want Tom dead and that her behavior after the murder, including attempting to cash in on insurance policies and take control of the pub, indicated that she had been expecting and planning for Tom's death. The defense argued that there was no direct physical evidence linking Catherine to the actual shooting, that the witnesses against her were unreliable criminals, and that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. Catherine herself testified, denying all the allegations and presenting herself as a devoted wife who had been devastated by Tom's murder. However, her testimony was unconvincing to many observers, who noted inconsistencies in her account and a lack of genuine emotion when discussing her husband's death. After a lengthy trial, the jury found Catherine Nevin guilty of murder and guilty of 3 counts of soliciting others to murder Tom Nevin. She was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder, with additional sentences for the solicitation charges, and she was led from the court protesting her innocence, a protest she would continue to make for the rest of her life. The conviction was based primarily on the testimony of the witnesses who said Catherine had tried to hire them to kill Tom, testimony that the jury found credible despite the defense's efforts to discredit them. In the years following her conviction, Catherine launched multiple appeals, arguing that she had not received a fair trial and that the evidence against her was insufficient, but all her appeals were rejected, with the courts finding that her conviction was safe and properly obtained. Catherine Nevin remained in prison until her death in 2018, never admitting guilt and continuing to maintain that she had been wrongly convicted. Throughout her incarceration, she remained a controversial figure, with some people believing that she had indeed been wrongly convicted based on the testimony of unreliable witnesses, while others were convinced of her guilt based on the pattern of solicitations and the circumstances of Tom's death. The question of who actually carried out the shooting of Tom Nevin has never been definitively answered, as while Catherine was convicted of arranging the murder, no one was ever charged with being the actual triggerman, leading to speculation that the person or persons who carried out the killing may have been professional criminals who were never identified or who were protected by Catherine's refusal to cooperate with investigators. The case raised significant questions about domestic violence, gender dynamics in criminal trials, and the role of the media in high-profile cases, with Catherine's manipulation of her public image and her attempts to use her gender and appearance to gain sympathy being widely discussed. For Tom Nevin's family, Catherine's conviction brought some measure of justice, though the fact that the actual shooter was never identified and that Catherine never admitted guilt meant that many questions remained unanswered. The Black Widow case, as it became known in the media, remains one of Ireland's most famous murder cases, remembered for the calculated nature of the planning, the sensational trial, and the figure of Catherine Nevin herself, a woman who sought to have her husband murdered for financial gain and who nearly succeeded in evading justice through manipulation, deception, and the exploitation of her relationships with influential people. Number 6. The Scissor Attack. The attempted murder of Marilyn Rynn. On February 11, 1995, Marilyn Rynn, a 32-year-old mother and wife living in Fermoy, County Cork, was brutally attacked in her own home by her husband Dermot, who stabbed her repeatedly with scissors in an assault so violent and sustained that it left Marilyn with life-threatening injuries and resulted in one of the most shocking attempted murder cases in Irish legal history. The attack occurred in the afternoon when Marilyn was at home with the couple's young daughter, and it came after months of escalating tension in the marriage, tension that had been caused by Dermot's gambling addiction, his financial problems, and his growing frustration with Marilyn's attempts to control his gambling and manage the family's precarious financial situation. Dermot Rynn had been gambling compulsively for years, losing substantial amounts of money at bookmakers and placing bets that he could not afford, debts that had accumulated to the point where the family was facing serious financial hardship. Marilyn, concerned about their financial stability and the impact of Dermot's gambling on their family, had taken steps to limit his access to money and had confronted him about his addiction, actions that Dermot resented and that he blamed for his unhappiness. On the day of the attack, Dermot had been drinking and had become increasingly agitated, his anger building to the point where he decided to attack Marilyn with a pair of scissors that he grabbed from the house. The attack was ferocious and sustained, with Dermot stabbing Marilyn multiple times in the head, face, neck, and upper body, wounds that were inflicted with such force and frequency that medical experts who later examined her injuries were astonished that she survived. During the attack, Marilyn fought desperately to defend herself and to protect their young daughter, who was in the house and who witnessed parts of the assault, a traumatic experience that would have lasting impacts on the child. Marilyn's screams and the commotion of the attack alerted neighbors, who called the Gardaí, and when police arrived at the scene, they found Marilyn bleeding profusely from multiple stab wounds, injuries that required immediate medical attention. She was rushed to hospital where she underwent emergency surgery to treat her injuries, which included wounds to her skull, face, and neck that had narrowly missed major blood vessels and organs, injuries that could easily have been fatal if they had been slightly different in location or depth. Dermot was arrested at the scene and taken into custody, where he initially gave statements that attempted to minimize his responsibility or to suggest that the attack had been provoked. But the evidence of the assault was overwhelming and undeniable. The physical evidence, including the scissors used in the attack, Marilyn's injuries, and the testimony of witnesses who had heard the assault, made it clear that this had been a sustained and vicious attack rather than a moment of sudden loss of control. Marilyn survived her injuries, though she was left with permanent scarring and ongoing physical and psychological trauma from the attack. And she faced a long recovery process that included multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. During her recovery, Marilyn showed extraordinary courage and resilience, not only in surviving the attack itself but in her determination to see justice done and to ensure that Dermot was held accountable for what he had done. The case went to trial, with Dermot Rynn charged with attempted murder, and the trial heard evidence of the attack, Marilyn's injuries, and the circumstances that had led to the assault. The prosecution presented medical evidence showing the severity of the injuries and arguing that Dermot's actions demonstrated a clear intent to kill Marilyn, as the number and nature of the stab wounds could not be explained as anything other than an attempt to end her life. Expert witnesses testified about the injuries and the force required to inflict them, and Marilyn herself gave testimony about the attack and the terror she had experienced. The defense attempted to argue that Dermot had not intended to kill Marilyn, that the attack had been the result of a loss of control brought on by stress and drinking, and that his gambling problems and financial pressures had affected his mental state. But these arguments were undermined by the evidence of the sustained and deliberate nature of the attack. The jury found Dermot Rynn guilty of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to a substantial prison term, though the exact length of the sentence reflected the court's consideration of various factors including the severity of the attack, the impact on Marilyn and their daughter, and Dermot's previous history. The case attracted significant media attention and public discussion, particularly because of the horrific nature of the attack and because it highlighted the dangers of domestic violence and the risks faced by women in their own homes from partners who may become violent. Marilyn's survival and her willingness to testify against her attacker were seen as acts of courage, and her case became an example used by domestic violence advocates to illustrate the severity of partner violence and the importance of taking threats and escalating behaviors seriously. In the years since the attack, Marilyn has spoken publicly about her experience, working with domestic violence organizations to raise awareness and to support other survivors of partner violence, using her own story to help others recognize warning signs and to encourage victims to seek help before situations escalate to violence. The case also prompted discussions about gambling addiction and its impacts on families, as Dermot's compulsive gambling had been a significant factor in the deterioration of the marriage and had contributed to the financial and emotional pressures that preceded the attack. For Marilyn, the attack and its aftermath represented a complete disruption of her life, requiring her to rebuild not only her physical health but also her sense of safety and her life as a single mother raising a child who had been traumatized by witnessing the violence. The strength and resilience she demonstrated in the face of such violence and trauma made her story one of survival and determination, even as it remained a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the potential for seemingly ordinary relationships to turn deadly. Dermot Rynn's attack on Marilyn with scissors remains one of the most brutal domestic violence cases in Irish legal history, a case that demonstrated the extreme violence that can occur in domestic settings and the importance of recognizing and intervening in situations where partner violence is escalating before it reaches such catastrophic levels. Number 7. Mark Nash, the Grangegorman and Catherine Doyle murders. Mark Nash is one of Ireland's most notorious killers, convicted of 2 separate double murders that shocked the nation and that demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence that has made him a figure of particular concern within the Irish prison system. The first of these cases involved the murders of Sylvia Shiles and Mary Callanan, 2 elderly women who were killed in their home in Grangegorman, Dublin on March 6, 1997, in circumstances that were so brutal and seemingly motiveless that the case generated intense public fear and extensive media coverage. Sylvia and Mary were both patients at the nearby psychiatric hospital and were living in supervised accommodation in the Grangegorman area. And on the night of their deaths, they were attacked in their beds by an intruder who stabbed them repeatedly with a knife, killing both women in an assault that appeared to have no rational explanation or clear motive. The savagery of the attack and the vulnerability of the victims created widespread fear in the community, and the Gardaí launched a major investigation to identify and apprehend the killer. Initially, the investigation focused on Dean Lyons, a young man with mental health issues and a history of drug abuse, who confessed to the murders after being questioned by police. Lyons provided details of the crime that police believed only the killer could know, and he was charged with the murders, a development that seemed to bring the investigation to a successful conclusion. However, serious questions soon emerged about the reliability of Lyons' confession, with concerns that he had been manipulated or had confessed to crimes he did not commit, possibly due to his mental state or in the hope of receiving treatment for his drug addiction. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Mark Nash, who had no connection to the original investigation, was arrested for a different double murder that occurred in August 1997. Nash had killed Catherine Doyle and her son Carl, stabbing them to death in their home in Castlebar, County Mayo, in another brutal and seemingly motiveless attack. Catherine was Nash's ex-partner, and the murder occurred after Nash had been drinking heavily and had become enraged. He attacked Catherine and Carl with a knife, killing both of them in a frenzied assault, and he was arrested shortly after when he turned himself in to police and confessed to the killings. During questioning about the Castlebar murders, Nash also confessed to the Grangegorman murders, providing details about the Shiles and Callanan killings that suggested he had intimate knowledge of the crime. His confession to the Grangegorman murders threw the case into confusion, as Dean Lyons had already been charged with those same murders, creating the extraordinary situation where two different people had confessed to the same double homicide. The Gardaí faced the difficult task of determining which confession was genuine and which was false, a process that involved re-examining all the evidence and the circumstances of both confessions. Ultimately, the authorities concluded that Nash's confession to the Grangegorman murders was more credible than Lyons' confession, and the charges against Lyons were dropped, though he was never fully exonerated and he died of a drug overdose in 2000 before the full truth could be established. Nash, however, retracted his confession to the Grangegorman murders after making it, claiming that he had falsely confessed and that he had not actually committed those killings, leaving the Grangegorman case in legal limbo. Despite his retraction, many investigators and legal experts believed that Nash was indeed responsible for the Grangegorman murders, and efforts were made to prosecute him for those crimes. But the complexities of the case and the issues surrounding both confessions made prosecution difficult. Nash was, however, convicted of the murders of Catherine and Carl Doyle in Castlebar, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment for those killings, a conviction that was based on solid evidence including his confession, forensic evidence from the scene, and witness testimony. The trial for the Doyle murders revealed the brutality of Nash's attack and his capacity for extreme violence, with medical evidence showing that both victims had been stabbed multiple times in a sustained assault. Nash's motive for the Castlebar murders appeared to be rage and resentment toward his ex-partner, combined with the disinhibiting effects of alcohol, though the level of violence he employed shocked even experienced investigators. While serving his sentence for the Castlebar murders, Nash remained a suspect in the Grangegorman case, and in 2015, nearly 2 decades after the murders of Sylvia Shiles and Mary Callanan, Nash was finally charged with those killings as well. The decision to charge him came after a lengthy investigation and review of all the evidence, including advances in forensic science and re-examination of the confessions and other evidence. However, prosecuting the Grangegorman case proved extremely challenging given the passage of time, the issues with the confessions, and the fact that Dean Lyons had previously been charged with the same crimes. Nash's trial for the Grangegorman murders took place in 2017, and it featured extensive legal arguments about the admissibility of his confession and other evidence. The prosecution argued that Nash's confession to the Grangegorman murders contained details that only the killer could have known and that corroborated evidence supported his involvement, while the defense argued that Nash's confession had been unreliable and that there was insufficient evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he had committed the murders. The trial was complex and lengthy, involving expert testimony about the confessions, the forensic evidence, and the circumstances of the murders. Ultimately, in October 2017, the jury found Mark Nash guilty of the murders of Sylvia Shiles and Mary Callanan, a verdict that finally brought legal resolution to a case that had remained unresolved for 20 years. Nash was sentenced to life imprisonment for the Grangegorman murders, to be served in addition to his existing life sentence for the Castlebar murders, meaning that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. The conviction brought some measure of closure to the families of Sylvia Shiles and Mary Callanan, who had waited 2 decades for justice, and it vindicated the investigators who had believed that Nash was responsible despite the complications of the case. The Grangegorman case also highlighted serious problems with police interrogation practices and confession evidence, particularly in light of Dean Lyon's false confession, and it prompted reforms in how vulnerable suspects are questioned and how confessions are obtained and evaluated. The case of Mark Nash stands as one of the most complex and disturbing in Irish criminal history, involving 4 murders committed in 2 separate incidents, false confessions, decades of legal proceedings, and questions about police practices and the reliability of confession evidence. Nash's capacity for extreme violence against vulnerable victims, combined with the confusion created by multiple confessions and the lengthy delay before he was finally convicted of all the murders, made this case particularly troubling and highlighted the challenges faced by the criminal justice system in dealing with complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions and evolving evidence. Number 8. Ian Bailey. On December 23, 1996, the body of Sophie Toscan du Plantier, a 39-year-old French television producer, was found outside her holiday home near Shull in West Cork, beaten to death in a brutal attack that occurred on a remote laneway in one of Ireland's most scenic and peaceful regions. Sophie had traveled to Ireland from Paris just days before to spend the Christmas holiday at her cottage, a place she loved and where she had spent time writing and enjoying the tranquility of the Irish countryside. But instead of a peaceful holiday, she met a violent death that remains officially unsolved in Ireland, though a suspect has been identified and convicted in absentia in France, creating an extraordinary international legal situation that continues to this day. Sophie's body was discovered by a neighbor on the morning of December 23rd, lying on the laneway near the entrance to her property, and it was immediately clear that she had been the victim of a violent assault. She had suffered severe head injuries from being beaten with a concrete block or similar object, injuries that had been inflicted with such force that her skull was fractured in multiple places. The attack appeared to have been frenzied and brutal, and there was evidence that Sophie had tried to flee from her attacker, as her injuries suggested she had been struck multiple times as she attempted to escape. The discovery of Sophie's body shocked the local community in West Cork, a rural area where violent crime was virtually unknown and where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. The Gardaí launched a major investigation, bringing in detectives from Dublin and conducting extensive searches and interviews in the area. The investigation quickly focused on Ian Bailey, a British journalist and poet who was living in the area with his partner Jules Thomas. Bailey had inserted himself into the investigation in the early days, acting as a freelance journalist covering the story and offering to help the Gardaí with their inquiries, behavior that some investigators found suspicious and that drew attention to him as a potential suspect. Within days of the murder, people in the local community began reporting that Bailey had told them he had been at the scene or that he had scratched hands that could have come from a struggle, reports that increased police interest in him. Bailey had a history of alcohol abuse and had previously been violent toward his partner, including an incident that had required police intervention, factors that made him seem like a plausible suspect to investigators. However, the evidence against Bailey was largely circumstantial and based on witness statements rather than physical evidence, as no forensic evidence definitively linked him to the crime scene or to Sophie. The Gardaí arrested Bailey twice in connection with the murder, in 1997 and again in 1998, questioning him extensively but ultimately releasing him without charge both times due to insufficient evidence to prosecute. The Director of Public Prosecutions reviewed the evidence and concluded that there was not enough to bring charges, a decision that frustrated the investigation team and Sophie's family, who were convinced that Bailey was responsible for the murder. In the absence of a prosecution in Ireland, Sophie's family pursued justice through the French legal system. As Sophie was a French citizen and French law allows for the prosecution of crimes against French citizens even if they occur abroad. French investigators re-examined the evidence and conducted their own investigation, including interviewing Bailey and other witnesses, and they built a case against Bailey that they believed was sufficient to warrant prosecution. In 2019, a French court tried Bailey in absentia for the murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier, a trial that Bailey refused to attend, maintaining his innocence and arguing that he could not receive a fair trial in France. The French court heard evidence from witnesses who testified about Bailey's suspicious behavior, his admissions and inconsistent statements, and circumstantial evidence that placed him near the scene around the time of the murder. In May 2019, the French court found Ian Bailey guilty of the voluntary homicide of Sophie Toscan du Plantier and sentenced him to 25 years imprisonment, a conviction that was celebrated by Sophie's family as finally bringing justice for her murder. However, because the conviction was in absentia and because Ireland and France do not have an extradition treaty that would allow Ireland to surrender Bailey to France to serve his sentence, Bailey remained free in Ireland, living in West Cork and continuing to maintain his innocence. The Irish authorities refused to extradite Bailey to France, citing Irish law and constitutional protections, and Bailey successfully fought extradition attempts through the Irish courts, arguing that the French conviction was unsafe and that he had not received due process. Bailey remained a controversial figure in West Cork, with some locals believing in his innocence and supporting him, while others were convinced of his guilt and viewed his continued presence in the area as an affront to Sophie's memory. The case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and extensive media coverage, with journalists and filmmakers examining the evidence and the characters involved, and the case has become one of Ireland's most famous unsolved murders despite the French conviction. Bailey himself courted media attention, giving interviews, writing poetry about the case, and maintaining a public profile that many found inappropriate given the circumstances. In January 2022, Ian Bailey died at his home in West Cork at the age of 66, taking with him to the grave the truth about what happened to Sophie Toscan du Plantier, at least as far as any confession or definitive admission is concerned. His death meant that he would never serve the sentence imposed by the French court and that the case would never be prosecuted in Ireland, leaving the murder officially unsolved in Irish law even though a French court had convicted him. For Sophie's family, Bailey's death was a bitter end to their quest for justice, as while they had secured a conviction in France, they never saw Bailey held accountable in a way that would have provided full closure, never saw him imprisoned for his crime, and never received any admission or explanation of what happened that night in December 1996. The murder of Sophie Toscan du Plantier remains one of Ireland's most troubling and high-profile cases, a murder that occurred in a peaceful rural community, that was investigated extensively but never prosecuted in Ireland, and that highlighted the complexities of international law and justice when crimes cross borders. The case raised questions about the adequacy of the Gardaí investigation, the decision not to prosecute Bailey in Ireland despite the suspicions against him, and the challenges of achieving justice when different legal systems have different standards and procedures. For many who have followed the case, the French conviction of Ian Bailey represents justice for Sophie, a legal acknowledgement that she was murdered and that Bailey was responsible, even if that conviction could never be enforced. For others, the case represents a failure of the Irish justice system to properly investigate and prosecute a murder that occurred on Irish soil, and a frustration with the legal technicalities that prevented Bailey from being held accountable in Ireland. Sophie's family has worked to keep her memory alive, establishing the Sophie Toscan du Plantier Award for Human Rights Journalism and continuing to speak publicly about her life and her death, ensuring that she is remembered not just as a murder victim but as a talented producer, a loving mother, and a woman who loved Ireland and who deserved to live out her life in peace.